Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for this video we're going to be taking some mid weapons and we're going to be trying to turn them into really cool, powerful builds, fun builds in general, and we're going to take a few average weapons and make them better as well. Before we continue though, definitely be sure to check out the description below for 20% off of G Fuel and 3 extra months free on a yearly subscription of ExpressVPN. You can support the channel through those links as well. The first one here is the Forked Greatsword. Definitely, by the way, be sure to comment your favorite non-meta weapon, and we ended up using Repeating Thrust, and we came up with a really powerful build. As you can see, the damage here was solid on New Game Plus 7. Let's get new equipment. For equipment, we have the Forked Greatsword in quality. We ran it as a quality build with Repeating Thrust, Blood Flame Blade, any seal will do. We have the white mask on, we hit 51 poise, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Roddenwing Sword Insignia, Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. Now let's talk about stats. For buffs, by the way, we're using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and then we have Blood Flame Blade. We managed to get to 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 26 Endurance, and this is a quality build, so when we're two-handing it, we're getting around 52 Strength and 50 Dexterity. Now, the Forked Greatsword isn't actually that bad. In quality affinity, it gets enough damage. As you can see on the Draconic Tree Sentinel, we ended up doing a fairly good amount of damage and bleed for a solid build for the Forked Greatsword. Next up here is the Grossmessers. Now, the Grossmessers can actually be decent, however, they are outclassed by the Bandit Curved Swords and several other curved swords in most statistical categories. At literally just 0.5 more weight, the Bandit Curved Sword actually has better base damage and scaling, although you're going to be running mostly a dexterity build. That being said, these weapons themselves are more along the lines of quality, and you can actually run them as a strength and arcane build. And at higher levels, you can get really good AR out of them because they get a good amount from strength and a decent amount from dexterity too, giving you a C in both in blood affinity. And in my offhand, the only affinity that it beats the Bandit Curved Swords in is actually Cold Affinity, where you'll get a C in Dexterity, a C in Strength, and a C in Intelligence. So a C across the board for that as far as Cold Affinity goes. So you can make use of them, and at higher levels, they're even better. For equipment, we have 2 Grossmessers, one with Seppuku and Blood Affinity, one with Chilling Mist and Cold Affinity. We have the White Mask and Raptor's Black Feathers. We hit 51 poise, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Roddenwing Sword Insignia, Claw Talisman, Melissen's Prosthesis. Then we have the Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. Let's talk about stats for this build. Now, even though it's very much a quality weapon in blood affinity, it will lean a little bit more towards strength. So you can run this as a strength and arcane build, and at later levels, at high levels, the Grossmessers can be quite good. However, at rune level 150, there's a lot of the other curved swords that are just going to beat them out. That being said, if for some reason you want to use them, you can still make them pretty powerful. Next one up here is Axe of Godrick. Now, this is definitely not my favorite weapon in the game, and it's certainly hard to build around. That being said, we're able to make a fun build that does reasonable damage, and we're going to talk about this weapon and how it basically has no hyper armor, and it can be a little bit difficult to land its Ash of War. So going over the weapon itself, it's once again a quality weapon. It gets points both from strength and dexterity, despite the fact that it has a hefty strength requirement to begin with, which can definitely be one of its downsides. Now, if I were to redo this build, after I show off this build, it's going to be built mainly around the Ash of War. There is one thing I realized: the charged attacks on it actually have a fairly good amount of reach, and they do decent damage. So if you wanted to add the Axe Talisman and the charged tier, you could probably get a lot out of them. But as far as the Ash of War itself, it's just not that great because it seriously lacks hyper armor. Even with 51 poise, I've actually used this Ash when I had 101 poise at one point, and even with that, you can still get knocked out of it fairly easily. Pretty much anything can knock you out of it too. But that being said, you do get decent charged attacks with this weapon, and the Ash does do good damage when it hits. And after we take the Magma Worm down here, not too challenging of a boss, we're going to go over equipment. We have the Axe of Godrick plus 10. Any seal will do. I was just using it for buffs. We have a random set of armor on. If you want to check that out, we have 51 poise, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Erdtree's Favorite plus 2, Defense Tier, Fate Tier. Now let's talk about stats for this build. Another quality build and setup where we're going to have 50 strength and 50 dexterity. It could lean slightly more towards strength, but that being said, it's very much a quality weapon, so you get a lot of damage hitting 50 in both when two-handing it. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for our buffs. And we hit 60 Vigor as well, 20 Mind, and 26 Endurance for a well-rounded build for the Axe of Godrick. Next up here is one that was requested in Cipher Pata. Now, Cipher Pata is pure holy damage. For me, it's basically outclassed by the Coated Sword. I like the Coated Sword much better for the poise damage and the range that it has. But that being said, Cipher Pata you can actually turn into a powerful build as well. The Coated Sword in general is just an upgrade, at least for me, because you're going to get more range out of it and you get a little bit more poise damage. But even so, the faith scaling it has, the fact that it's literally weightless, does enough damage, and you can combo it with anything else that you want that's faith related, makes it a very powerful and viable build to run through most of Elden Ring. Sure, it's far from perfect, but yeah, you get an A scaling once you get it to plus 10 in your Faith stat, and then you could use whatever Faith incantations or anything that you choose to use with it. You get some poise damage out of the Ash of War, and even though the Coated Sword is generally better, the scaling alone, the fact that it's weightless, it combos very well into a pure Faith caster build, something you can run as a weapon to complement that. Let's get into equipment. For equipment on our Faith build, we have Cipher Pata, preferably plus 10. Erdtree Seal goes well with this. We have the Crucible Axe set on. We have the Sacred Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Holy Tier, Faith Tier. Let's talk about stats for this build. For our buffs, we're using Golden Vow and Howler Shaburi to boost the damage. Because it's not physical damage, so Flame Grant Me Strength will not work. We hit 70 Faith with the Faith tier. We have 60 Vigor, 23 Mind, 26 Endurance. All in all, a well-rounded Faith-based build where you can throw in different incantations and things that you like. Holy incantations would fit the build well overall. By the way, I want to show this clip real quick on an NPC Invader. This can also go through shields too, so you have that advantage also. Yeah, it does really good damage to NPC invaders and regular enemies too when they use shields and stuff like that. As you can see, she went up there to use Waterfowl and we ended up knocking down Melissa and taking her out in a cool clip with Cipher Pata. Now for one of the worst weapons in Elden Ring, the Forked Hatchet. I ended up trying at least 10 different Ashes of War with the Forked Hatchet and couldn't really come up with anything amazing. However, Wild Strikes on it with Bloodflame Blade if you run it as a bleed build, because you're going to get around 90 bleed build up and it's relatively quick, can turn into a solid build despite the fact that the weapon itself is just lackluster. This is literally a bottom 5 weapon in Elden Ring. You're going to see me get beat up a lot here because I ended up just getting greedy with it and trying to use Wild Strikes as much as I can to get bleed build up, because that's the best you're going to get from a weapon like this. You can turn it into an okay build, decent, maybe even good build with Wild Strikes. That being said though, it doesn't have a lot of range, doesn't have a lot of AR or damage, and it's just not really a good weapon. But I'm sure you can beat up some bosses like this. I imagine if you were able to use the Shackle against Mog or Morgott, or Moog, I always say his name wrong. But anyways, Moog or Margit or Morgott or any of them, you could probably end up getting enough bleed build up and damage on them to take them out fairly quickly, even with the Forked Hatchet, because you're getting 90 bleed and Wild Strikes isn't bad at all. It's a really solid Ash of War. Now, I can't speak to PvP. I know there's some issues going on with PvP right now. I've had some people make comments on my channel and stuff, and I know there's some stuff they definitely need to work on as far as PvP balancing goes. But as far as PvE, they did a really good job with balancing out, so there's not too many terrible weapons in the game. Aside from Vare's Bouquet and maybe this Forked Hatchet here and a few weapons, most of them are at least viable, which is really awesome. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Forked Hatchet and Keen Affinity where it gets an A, not that that matters, but we're using Bloodflame Blade on it. We have the Crucible Tree set on, NEC will do, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Shard of Alexander, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Millicent's Prosthesis, Thorny Tier, Faith Tier. Let's talk about stats. As mentioned, I ran this as a Dexterity build. We're using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Bloodflame Blade. We had 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 26 Endurance. We managed to get to 75 Dexterity for what I would call a decently well-rounded build for a weapon that's just not that great. Now the next build here is one of the builds on here that's kind of average. It's actually decent to begin with, and I just wanted to see if I can make it any better, and that is the Ornamental Straight Swords. Now, after you activate the Ash of War, you get an additional, I believe it's around 100 flat holy damage, and then you get that unique R2 where you can just get the successive attack build up like crazy and consistently build up damage on whatever boss or enemy you're facing. So I tested this with the Shard of Alexander and without the Shard of Alexander. It doesn't seem to impact it, which makes sense because the input that you end up using turns into right trigger or R2. And yeah, it makes sense in the end. I'm going to show my equipment, which will have the shard, but I'll mention another talisman you can use instead to get a lot of damage out of it. Let's get into equipment. And we have the Ornamental Straight Swords, plus 10 preferably. Any seal will do. We had a random set of armor on, hit 51 poise. Ritual Swords Talisman. You can use the blue Dancer Charm and go lightweight for even more damage. Rotwing Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. Let's talk about stats for this build. Yeah, the Sacred Scorpion Charm is only going to boost it by about 12 damage, so the Blue Dancer Charm would definitely be the better way to go if you want to go lightweight and get even more physical damage out of it. For the buffs, we're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. We have 60 Vigor and 75 Dexterity. Overall, not a bad weapon. Definitely can build up a lot of damage with the successive attacks. Even though it's a little bit difficult to land at times, they can be quite powerful. Next up here, we have a basic straight sword build where we're going to be showing off Square Off. Now, Square Off, and you've seen this build before if you're a fan of my channel, and the glint blades goes well together. Straight swords in general are definitely lackluster. They're not very much used in Elden Ring because they're outclassed by curved swords and katanas and other weapons in the game. That being said, you can make a powerful straight sword build with almost any straight sword in the game by combining Square Off with the glint blades. And when you're using Square Off and you have that longer animation on the R2 or the right trigger rather, you'll actually get a lot of damage out of the Ash of War that way too. And then the poise damage between that and the glint blades will give you around 80 poise damage each time when it all lands. That being said, I'm on New Game Plus 7, so they do have an additional around 30% more poise, but even so, we're able to get some breaks and some solid damage out of a straight sword. I truly feel like Square Off is one of the most underrated Ashes of War in the game, and not a lot of people talk about it because I feel like a lot of people don't use straight swords in Elden Ring, which is in contrast to a lot of the Dark Souls series where we're typically using a sword shield. Elden Ring is a little bit different because it allows us to be a lot more versatile, and there's so many weapons in the game that often straight swords kind of get forgotten about, but they can be powerful too. Let's get into equipment. We ran the straight sword as a quality build. You can pretty much do this on any straight sword. We have the dagger with the glint blades on them for a lot of posture damage. Any seal will do. Knight's Cavalry Set Altered, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Ritual Shield Talisman. Then we have the defense tier, Fate tier. Let's talk about stats for this build. Now with this one I tested it because you're holding down L2 or left trigger and then you're using right trigger, it will be boosted by the Shard of Alexander. That being said, we ran this at a quality build, but you can also use this as a keen build or dexterity for a lot of damage. Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength were our buffs. The next one up here is the basic Flail. Now we're not doing this on a bleed build necessarily. You can add in Blood Flame Blade if you want, but you can actually get a lot of poise damage, posture damage with the Flail and Lion's Claw. And you can see here we're able to get in a couple of critical breaks and a good amount of damage. I think I end up running out of FP at the end, but it ultimately doesn't matter. The Flail is a pretty underrated weapon. You can use a lot of different Ashes of War. Spinning weapon's really good on them too. Overall, they're not as bad as they would seem to be at first. They're not that popular, but you can get good damage out of them. And if you throw in an Ash of War like I did there with Lion's Claw, you can end up getting some serious poise damage as well. Alright, let's go over equipment for this build and setup. We have the Keen Flail. We're running it as a dex build with Lion's Claw on it. Any seal will do. We had a random set of armor on. We did hit 51 poise if you want to check that out. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Shield Talisman, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. We have the Poise Breaking tier, the Stone Barb Crack tier, Fate tier. Let's talk about the stats. So we're running this as a dexterity build once again. We ended up with 70 dexterity, 60 vigor, 20 mind, 26 endurance. This is a well-rounded build that could basically work around using something like Lion's Claw for poise damage, but once again you can also use Spinning Weapon with Blood Flame Blade to get a really good build on a Flail too. Overall, flails are pretty underrated. They're average weapons, but you can make them powerful as well. And the next one up here is one that has seriously short reach at times, and that's the brick hammer, which all in all ends up being average mostly, but we're going to talk about how you can turn it into a very powerful build. Now, some people may disagree and think that it's a great weapon, and it can be really good. There's certain things you can throw on it to make it powerful, but I wanted to highlight this in this video because of the fact that it does generally have a short reach, the jump attacks aren't fantastic, and it's generally an average weapon. If you do this in Faith scaling with Flame Art or Sacred Affinity, you'll actually get a B in Faith, and you can end up with a really powerful build. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Flame Art Brick Hammer with Flaming Strike on it, a very awesome and powerful Ash of War. Any seal will do. The Erdtree seal would go well with this. Random set of armor on, Fire Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Fire Tier, Faith Tier. Let's talk about stats. For stats, we got to 70 Faith with the Faith tier. We were using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength because we're doing both fire and physical damage. And we've got 60 Vigor, 23 Mind, 26 Endurance, and we've got enough Strength so we can two-hand this. That being said, Sacred Affinity, Flame Art Affinity, you get good base damage and a B in those affinities, giving you a powerful option for the Brick Hammer to turn it into a very solid Faith build. So the next up is another average weapon that I wanted to turn into something good, and that's the Dragon Halberd. Now, the Dragon Scale Blade really isn't too great all in all. It can go well with some other weapons. You pair it like with the Rivers of Blood, for example, to get in a little bit of frost buildup, but overall, the Dragon Halberd is the better of the two. This ends up being one of the most intense fights I've ever had with Morgott, by the way. It comes down to the absolute wire and ended up being a little bit more of a tough fight than I expected. I ended up getting him on the third try, but it went on for a little bit. Anyways, as far as the Dragon Halberd goes, it's pretty decent. You can turn it into a solid build. It is locked behind Spinning Slash, but you get the extra lightning damage along with the frost buildup. Now, it's decent as far as the jump attacks and whatnot, too. The only issue here, the reason that it's not as great as it can be, is because there's a lot of other Halberds in the game that are just going to beat it in terms of AR, and having that Spinning Slash Ash of War and not really being able to change it, especially since it's a little bit on the slower side, can be a little bit of a challenge to pull off as well. All in all, I like this weapon, and I'm not going to call it mid, but I am going to call it average. It's definitely an average weapon. If we were able to change the Ash of War for something a little bit better that had the lightning and frost buildup, but something better than Spinning Slash on the weapon itself. Spinning Slash is really nice when you have like bleed builds and such, but for a frost-based weapon with a little bit of lightning damage, and the fact that it's a little bit of a bigger weapon, so as you can see here, the whole animation's a little bit long to pull off, has a lot of downsides, but it does have its upsides too. And one of those upsides is how cool it is, the whole ice lightning theme, and the fact that it does beat the Dragon Scale Blade, which for me, I really haven't found too much of a use for. As far as the Dragon Halberd though, if you're looking for a really fun weapon for a playthrough, definitely give it a try. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Dragon Halberd plus 10, any seal will do. We have the Knight's Cavalry set on Altered, Melissan's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Rottenwing Sword Insignia, Thorny Tier, Faith Tier. That's Margit's Shackle, by the way, that knocks him down. Let's get into stats. Now, this weapon will actually lean more towards strength, so if I were to redo these stats, I'd probably go for 60 strength and about 30 dexterity, but I ran it as a quality build so that I could use a whole bunch of other quality type builds like Bloodhound's Fang at the same time. All in all, though, it gets a B in strength and a C in dexterity, and you can turn into a fun and powerful build. And this is an extra build if you saw it in the description. This is just something that I was messing around with different builds. This isn't really a mid weapon. It's actually quite good in the Godskin Stitcher. And if you use Giant Hunt or Impaling Thrust, you can turn it into a very powerful build. And this was just something that I decided to add because I did a build for it and figured I'd throw it in this video as well. So if you put an Impaling Thrust on this and you run it as a dexterity build or Giant Hunt on a dexterity or even heavy build, you can get a lot of posture damage out of the Godskin Stitcher and a fairly decent amount of damage as well. I don't use thrusting swords that much, so it was nice to try it out and come up with a build for it. By the way, don't forget to comment your favorite non-meta weapon, a weapon that's not used very often in Elden Ring that you like to use often, because I'm curious as to what weapons you guys are using, and if you want to see another video like this one where we look at more obscure weapons and make builds for them. All in all, by the way, I ended up liking the Godskin Stitcher. It's definitely not mid or average. It's a pretty good build overall. If you're looking for a thrusting sword build, I recommend Impaling Thrust on a Dex build or Giant Hunt on a heavy build. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Godskin Cicher in Keen Affinity with Impaling Thrust on it. Any seal will do. We have a random set of armor on if you want to check that out. Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Oxander, Ritual Shield Talisman, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Stone Barb, Cracked Tier, Faith Tier. Let's talk about stats. And we're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. This is a Dexterity build. I ended up running it when I was doing different Dexterity builds to see how well it would do, because I don't do a lot of builds for thrusting swords, and it ended up coming out pretty well. Yeah, it's really not that bad. Thrusting swords in general, they haven't really been my style per se. I know they're used a lot more in PvP than PvE, but that being said, you can still make powerful builds, especially with Giant Hunt and Impaling Thrust. I hope you enjoyed this look at non-meta weapons, a whole bunch of weapons that are kind of mid, some were average, and hopefully turning them into better, more powerful builds that you can use, and more importantly, most importantly, have fun in your playthroughs through Elden Ring. Let's hope DLC leaks and everything start to be true and we end up with DLC sometime between February and June is what I'm hoping for. I'm really looking forward to that. Between then, we're going to continue to make awesome Elden Ring builds and content. Be sure to subscribe.